hold that thought and we'll talk about that later, okay? How difficult it would be for a Jewish person who is brought up Yiddishkeit, where you have your whole way of life is kind of involved in transactions with other people, in close transactions. And here, they're going to be out on the North 40 and probably no contact with other people of that background. Education, all tied in here. By the way, I've got to say this about education. Just the other night, Rabbi, the grandson, called. I've already told you a little bit about him. But if I could tell you about as many of the Papermasters as I know of, and their advanced degrees, it would be absolutely amazing. If I can turn religious for a minute, Abraham was told that he was going to be a blessing to the people of the world. Well, let me tell you, when Rabbi Papermaster was sent to Grand Forks, he was truly a blessing, and a blessing through these children who have gone on to all kinds of wonderful accomplishments. Unfortunately, none are still here in Grand Forks, but it's something we need to talk about. Music, humor, Jewish humor. I just love it. And Ruth's husband has put some stuff on Jewish humor on the internet. Okay. Okay, now we're going to switch over to North Dakota now. Okay, Rabbi Papermaster is over there going to this very prestigious school, but in the meantime, there are pogroms going on, and the Jewish people are being driven out and abused in many different ways, and so many of the Jewish people wanted to move out of Europe because it was just a terrible place for them at the time. And the question was, well, where are they going to go? And someone said, well, go to America. That's where everybody else goes. And the question was, what are you going to do? Well, you homestead. Okay? So, a fellow by the name of Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was a philanthropist and a financier, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He was aware of what was going on. He lived over in Paris and in Vienna. And he believed that the East European Jewish refugees should become farmers. After all, if you look in the Bible, the Jewish people were farmers. So why shouldn't they be farmers over in America? Okay? So he set up a fund to aid Jewish immigrants. And he provided loans to individuals and for farm cooperatives. Because of Yiddishkeit, they wanted to have almost the concept of a colony so that Jewish people would be with Jewish people. Well, that's no different than the Norwegians. You know, if you look at a map of North Dakota, you'll find ethnic groups all over the place by grouping, even in Grand Forks. So Jewish farming colonies were established throughout America. Now here's a picture of the one from Bismarck, or Burleigh County, north of Bismarck. This was called the Painted Woods Colony. You see this almost idyllic kind of a picture here of life in North Dakota. Interesting, all those trees. Something they didn't tell them, you know. Anyway, building their log cabins, you know, and living out in this rustic setting and so forth, okay? So, what happened in North Dakota is that there were 5 colonies that were established. The first one was at Painted Woods, north of Bismarck, in about 1882. There's not much left anymore. There may be a cemetery, there may be a few graves, but that's all that's left there. A big one was in Garski, north of Devil's Lake. And that's the one that we're most closely affiliated with because that's where Rabbi Papermaster used to serve. Okay? And we'll talk about that. When this one, Painted Woods, kind of closed down, another one opened up in Ling, which was about 30, 40 miles to the east of there. And this book Dakota diaspora that is about life in that colony. Okay? Now, Ashley Wishing. It's interesting that not only did most of the Jews come from the Odessa area, southern Ukraine, but so did the Jewish people. So there was an affinity there with them. I want to talk a little bit about that colony because it's very interesting. And then there was the cowboy one. Way out here in the western corner of Montana and South Dakota, there was one in Bowman County. And we don't know much about that other than that it did in fact exist for a few years. Here's a picture of the Jewish cemetery at Garsky, or north of Devil's Lake. Okay? It's hard to find. It's way in the middle of a field, and you almost have to ask directions. But children of the Jewish children and grandchildren and so forth, descendants of the Jewish settlers, have really fixed this one up beautifully. So it's a wonderful place if you can find it. It's a wonderful place to go. And they put up a stone, and this lists the Jewish homesteaders that were there. And if you look at that, and if you've lived in Grand Forks for a long time, you'll see a lot of familiar names. Why? Because many of these people, they went out, they homesteaded, they worked very hard, like Rachel Caleb, but this was just not their life, you know. And so many of them moved into Grand Forks, where you had a large Jewish community, and then, well, we'll talk some more about that. But you can see a number of names here that are there. Anybody, maybe Rabbi, you could explain why Jewish people tend to put stones on gravestones, whereas most Christians tend to put flowers.
In the past, gravestones weren't necessarily as well built as they are today. So traditionally, when visiting a grave, one would add another stone, kind of make sure that it doesn't fall apart.
Yeah.
That tradition continues.
And it's certainly in the Middle East, where you have a lot of sand and so forth, the ground was unstable. You can see how difficult it would be to have a grave there. So the more stones you could have, the better off you'd be. Okay, here's the Ashley one, Beth Hitchcock. Is that Isaac? Okay. And Beth is what? Daughter of?
House.
House of. Okay. House of Isaac Cemetery there. And again, I don't know of any Jewish people still living in the Ashley area, but there is a beautiful cemetery there. Okay? And they list the names of the people who are there. I want to tell you a couple stories about this. Here's a picture of a group of people there at the Ashley cemetery. I'm not sure which one is the rabbi, whether this fellow is, or this fellow, or this, I don't know. Is there anything with Mark? Yeah. But anyway, this is at Ashley. But I want to tell you about the rabbi there. His name was Julian Hess. Okay. Here's Julian Hess. He was sponsored by the Jewish Chautauqua Society, which was like might be called a missionary board. So, you know, they would provide funds so that rabbis could go out to the hinterlands where these colonies were. And Julian Hess was one of those. Now, Julian Hess had a brother who was also a rabbi. And his name was Joelson. He had a son. You recognize Al Jolson? Yeah. Okay. That was his nephew, Hess's nephew. I'm just full of trivia. I love trivia. Okay, now I want to talk about the Berman family. Can I tell you, what is there about this Susan Berman? Anybody figured it out yet? Well, yeah, there was a Berman first, but this has been in the news lately. Almost all the time. Go ahead.
She was killed recently.
Yes, she was killed. This is that case of Durst. He supposedly killed his wife, and then he supposedly killed this friend of his, Susan. Well, anyway. Here's the Berman family. Now, he was brought up in that colony down in Ashley. This is just to show you that although so many of the Jewish people turned out to be just wonderful scholasticians, humanitarians, and so forth, there were a few scoundrels, okay? And this is Berman, and this is Susan Berman, the little girl that was killed, okay? Now, she wrote a book, Easy Street, and it's about her father. He was very much involved in the mob. He started out in Ashley getting into trouble, then he got in trouble in Sioux City and went on to Chicago and eventually Las Vegas. And he was involved in the Flamingo nightclub down there with Buck Siegel. And he died. But Susan decided she'd write a book about her father. And so that's what Easy Street is about. And in the book, she writes about going back to little town of Ashley to see where her dad and her grandparents came from. So if you ever get a chance, you may want to look at that book, Easy Street. It's kind of an interesting one in light of what's happened. Okay? She was killed, and we'll see what happens in that court case coming up. Painted Woods Gathering here again. We're not sure that this is a picture from Painted Woods, but we're reasonably sure that it is. That would be the one north of Bismarck. Okay, now we'll get on to Rabbi Papermaster. His name in Europe was Benjamin Papermaster, I think it was, at that time. He was born November 19, 1859, in the village of Amalova, near Kovno in Lithuania. He died September 24, 34 in Grand Forks, age 75. So he lived here for 43 years. He was rabbi for 43 years. I don't think there's any other clergy who stayed in one spot in Grand Forks for 43 years. Yeah, I think he probably was the senior person that way. Okay, now we're going to go back to Europe for a minute. The yeshiva that was there, we think this is a picture of where it was that he went to school. Okay, all of this was destroyed in the Second World War and prior to that. So. Okay, Vilna, Lithuania was called the Jerusalem of the North. 45% of its citizens were Jewish. Slobodka was the Jewish quarter of Kovno in Lithuania. It was renowned as a center of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. So this man, Papermaster, was brought up in that ultra-Orthodox school. But he had a little of what they call a Haskalah, the enlightenment in him. And he writes that at night sometimes he would, inside his book, he would have a second book so that he could read to find out what was happening with the prophets. You know, at that time apparently they were limited to just the first 5 books of what we would call the Bible, but he apparently had this interest even back then. He was under the jurisdiction of Reb Isaac Elkanan Spector, and he entered the Shiva at age 7. Okay? And he received his smichka, or ordainment, at age 18. So he was ready to go at age 18. Okay? But what did he do? Well, before I get that, let's explain this a little bit. Again, the rabbi can probably help you with this. But within Judaism, you certainly have the traditional role of a rabbi, which would be similar to the role of a priest or a minister. Okay, you're the worship leader, you're the teacher, you're But you also have the cantor. Many of the prayers are sung. There's a lot of wonderful music in a Jewish service. And generally, there's a separate person who's the cantor. If you saw that movie about, anyway, the Al Jolson one where...
Jesse.
What?
The jazz singer.
The jazz singer, yeah, the jazz singer. There was a cantor role in that for him, okay? But he leads the prayers, he's a musician. And in a larger congregation, you can have a rabbi, you can have a cantor, okay? But you also need somewhere in the community a shochet, shochet. This is my technical team here. Shochet. But this is the person who does the ritual slaughtering, okay, for kosher. So the meat is kosher, and there's many, many rules, and it takes a lot of education and training to know this role, okay? And then there's the mohel. Well, that's the one who does the circumcisions, okay? So, in a full Jewish community, you would need all four of these roles there, okay? Again, put yourself in Devil's Lake, out on the prairie, you might be lucky to have one. How are you going to have all four? Well, there's adaptation. There's a lot of adaptation that was made. Okay, now to go back to the rabbi. He's graduated at age 18. What is he to do? This just shows that the old one is torn down. Okay. He was fluent in Yiddish. In fact, that was the language they used in the household, Yiddish, which is a combination of German and Hebrew, and probably a few other languages in between. Hebrew, Russian, Lithuanian, German, and Polish. Very well-educated man. He took a position as a teacher and tutor and cantor. Unfortunately, he was drafted for service in the Russian army. Now, that happened a lot, but there were also a lot of draft dodgers. And he was one of those draft dodgers. He did not want to serve. Much of the reason was that if you were drafted, you were in for 25 years. And what was a Jew to do in terms of keeping kosher? I mean, and the whole way of life would be kind of destroyed by that. In 1880, he married Ethel Sudarsky, and they had 4 boys. He returned to the Kovno Rabbinate to receive certifications as a shochet and a mohel at age 24. So now he had all 4 of these. He was a cantor naturally. He had a beautiful voice and was apparently filled that role. I don't know if he had specialized training to do that, but anyway, he could do all 4 of these things. Okay, here's Rabbi Spector. Born in 1817, died in 1896. He was orthodox in his teaching, but very respectful of other viewpoints. He was appointed the chief rabbi of Kovno, Lithuania at age 47. He taught Papermaster in the Slobodka Yeshiva. He was really his mentor. There was a special relationship here. He was considered one of the greatest Talmudic sages and authorities around at that time. And in fact, I'll get it here in a minute, he was also a powerful advocate for Jewish people with Russian government. The Yeshiva University of Theological School in New York is named after him. Now that's high praise. Go ahead.
As well as a number of others, including in LA and other places.
Okay.
More than just one.
Just one, yeah, more than just one. Yeah, very well respected. Well, here was Rabbi Papermaster with this special relationship with him. Now, what happens? It was in the late summer of 1890, just before the high holidays, during the month of Elul, that a messenger arrived at our home in Alexot in the province of Kovno, telling my father to report without delay to the office of the chief rabbinate in Kovno. You can imagine, you get with all the troubles going on, you get somebody saying, you come, and you come right away, okay? gave no details for the reason for that summons quite naturally created a good deal of excitement. All he could say was that the call came directly from the chief rabbi himself and that my father was to return with him. Fears of one sort or another were ever present among Jewish families in Tsarist Russia, even in the case of a call from so eminent and honorable a place as the chief rabbinate, which in itself was also a government institution. My mother, who was not in the best of health, was quite apprehensive. My father was very curious. What did he want? Okay. On his arrival, he was introduced to the head of a family named Zurikov, who were on their way to America from the Ukraine section of Russia, but had instructions to stop at the Kovno Rabbinate for its recommendation of a man who would come with them to America to serve a community completely as a teacher, shochet, moel, cantor, so forth. They wanted an all-purpose person for that role. Okay? It was Rabbi Isaac Elkanan's opinion that my father was just the man who could fill the requirements of that community. My father was quite overcome with this sudden possibility and rather hesitatingly replied that he would have to consider the matter and discuss it first with his wife and family. So he went home. To my father, the prospect of going to America was quite exciting. He thought that was very good. He hated Tsarism vehemently and had vowed that his children would never serve the Tsar, especially in the army. He had 4 boys already. Okay. Now, with 4 sons, he realized that he must not relinquish this opportunity. He told me later that this was his one compelling reason for accepting the offer. He only regretted later that he did not insist that his family be taken along with him. The fact that Fargo, North Dakota was the Zurikov family's destination, that it was 2,000 miles west of New York, where several members of my mother's family had already emigrated, and that North Dakota was then a very sparsely settled country, generally did not enter his mind. All that mattered was that it was America, the land of the free. My mother was quite apprehensive about his leaving her and the family, but she did not deter him from going, knowing that members of the family were already there and feeling assured that she and the family would be sent for as soon as he settled. It says already there, I meant New York City. Okay. Rabbi Isaac Elkanan had told him rather plainly that not only must he consider this an opportunity for himself, but that it was also his Jewish duty to go with these people who urgently required the services he had been trained to render, particularly to the scattered Jewish communities of America. This, I believe, had much to do not only with his decision to go with these people, but also with the fact that he remained in North Dakota for the balance of his lifetime. He had an awe-inspiring regard for the chief rabbi of Kovno. I recall a framed photograph of the famous rabbi hanging in our living room in the house in Grand Forks. Okay, here's Rabbi Papermaster in a rather fancy outfit. He discussed the matter with his wife and children. He made it clear that it was his duty to make, Rabbi Elkanah made it clear it was his duty, you know. Prospect was exciting for many reasons. First of all, he could use all 4 areas of his training. Okay? Secondly, his sons could escape conscription in the army, Russian army. There were also pogroms going on in Russia at the time. It was a very, very difficult time. And plus just the excitement of a new country and equality, adventurous fellow. He decided to look at the position. Ethel and the children would stay behind. She was sickly.
At that time, because of his clothing, they have quite a bit of money. Because of his clothing at that time, they have quite a bit of money.
That picture was taken over here, and no, he never had quite a bit of money. Never. His son made that, when I talked to him the other night, he said it was, well, I'll get into that. His wife was sickly, Papermaster arrived in America on January 2nd, 1891, and Fargo was a disappointment. We all know. He arrived in Grand Forks in March of 1891. Unfortunately, Ethel died March 28, 1891. So about the time he stepped foot in Grand Forks, his wife died back in Lithuania. Now this creates not only an emotional hardship, but at that time, Rabbi, a Catholic priest isn't to be married, but a Jewish rabbi was to be married. I mean, that was the preferred kind of a thing, and so here he was now a single man, and that was going to create some problems. Okay, the Grand Forks Jewish community. While in Fargo, Papermaster learned about a thriving Jewish community about 75 miles to the north. Grand Forks had about 60 Jewish families. Several came from that Devil's Lake area. Later on, it was about 200 families. If you take 200 and a family size of 5, you're talking, what, 1,000? Okay. It was a large community. It was a patchwork quilt, though, of ethnicities, theological perspectives, and traditions. There were some German Jews, and they had been brought up more in the Reform movement. There were certainly the Hasidic Jews, and they had been brought up in their kind of a culture and way. There were secular Jews who really didn't want to be involved in any church, but they wanted that Jewish heritage and so forth. They met in a community hall for services. Papermaster went there to perform Passover services, and he never left. Well, he left the hall, but he never, he never left Grand Forks. They immediately formed the Congregation of the Children of Israel and called Rabbi Papermaster. Now there were some warning signs for a new rabbi. He received the news of my mother's passing. She died on March 28, 1891. It was in this despondent frame of mind that he arrived in Grand Forks just a week or 10 days before the Feast of Passover. He was encouraged to find that there were approximately 60 Jewish families, most of whom were in need of services. And so he made arrangements to remain over the holiday period on a so-called trial basis. He was not too certain about the possibility of being successfully accepted there, again because of all the different groups. He found that most of the families were originally from the Ukraine section of Russia, with a few Romanian families and Galician or Polish families. There were only 5 or 6 families of German origin. As is well known, Jews coming from southern Russia, Poland, and Romania were strongly influenced by their Hasidic background. Their Yiddish dialect was different. They pronounced Hebrew differently than the Lithuanians. My father decided that if he were going to remain there, he would have to adjust himself to their dialect and their customs. Not only, he wasn't saying, you got to adjust to me, I've got to adjust to you. The community at that time consisted of mainly younger men and women who were anxious to adjust themselves to a new life in this country. And when they discovered that in this young rabbi they had one who had liberal views in the practice of Judaism, they were happy and enthusiastic. It was amongst the younger men and women of the community, together with the moral and financial support of the German Jewish families, that the new rabbi received his support. These factors influenced his decision to remain in Grand Forks. Things to do. He accepted the job. He was over here in Grand Forks. What did he have to do? Well, first they had to form and incorporate a congregation. They had to plan and build a synagogue. They had to build a school. Cheater? Peter. They had to build a school because that's how else are the children going to learn Hebrew and religious training. You had to find and marry a wife. Okay? Well, he took care of that quickly. He had to secure a family home where they could live. He had to move his family to America. He had 4 boys. he had to personally adjust to a new world. And he had to unite the Jewish community somehow, bring them together, okay? So these are the things that he had to do. Now, just to show you the problem, okay, I'm going to tell you, or going to read this little story about Passover, his first Passover in Grand Forks, and what happened, okay? During the first Passover service, he was put to a rather severe test, religiously speaking. As he arrived only a few days before the Passover, his entire time was taken up with last-minute preparations for the holiday, providing kosher meat, killing of fowl, providing matzah, and other Passover necessities. And he also attended meetings of community leaders. By the way, he never wanted to be isolated from the rest of the community, and he was very much a part of it. The day prior to Passover is a traditional fast day on behalf of the firstborn. So Father was both tired and hungry by the time of the Seder service at the home of his hosts, the Greenbergs. The services at an improvised synagogue in a downtown hall had been rather lengthy, as everyone had wanted to meet the new Rabbi Cantor. Upon arriving at the Greenbergs, Father quite naturally expected the host to conduct the Seder service. Usually, in the home. Some time passed, and Father noticed that groups were whispering to one another and finally losing patience. Father inquired of the host why he did not proceed with the Seder service, the Passover service. Well, he replied, we're waiting for you as the rabbi to conduct the Seder service. In that case, Father replied, let us go to the table. Pulling up an ordinary chair, he waited for everyone to be seated and proceeded with the and the orderly ceremonial of the Seder, as recorded in the Haggadah, much to the delight of his hosts and all of the other people present. Having been accustomed to Hasidic ceremonials, they anticipated that the rabbi would expect to be provided with a special couch that had become traditional in the Hasidic background, a white robe, a hose, stockings, triangle, I think it's a hat, and so forth. In other words, these old timers were looking at it and what on earth have we got here? This guy doesn't respect the ways, of the congregation. And of course, he walked into it, he had no idea what it was. Before the Seder service was over, it had already spread throughout the community how the new rabbi had conducted it. The younger people were delighted, while the older men and more orthodox members either grumbled or openly denounced him